In January 1998, the suburban city of Arlington, Texas was shattered by the shocking and senseless murder of a young woman just trying to make her way to work. 19-year-old Amy Robinson, sweet, trusting, and developmentally disabled, was gunned down and left in a field like discarded trash. Her killers? Two men she knew and trusted. But this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't about money, jealousy, or revenge. It was about thrill. Michael Dewayne Hall, just 18, and his 23-year-old friend Robert Neville, didn't kill Amy out of desperation. They killed her because they wanted to know what it felt like to hunt a human. With a rifle, a crossbow, and a pellet gun in hand, they turned the countryside into their killing ground, and Amy into their target. This case wasn't just evil. It was deliberate, calm, and proudly confessed. In fact, after their arrest, the two men would go on television and brag about what they did, smirking as they described Amy's final moments. To understand how two young men descended into such depravity, and how a vulnerable young woman became their chosen victim, we have to go back to where it all started. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a case that explores the darkest corners of the human mind, and what justice really means. Amy Robinson was just 19 years old, a sweet and gentle soul who lived a quiet life in Arlington, Texas, where she was known for her bright smile, her helpful nature, and her love for simple routines. Born with developmental disabilities, Amy had the cognitive level of a young teenager, yet she carried herself with the dignity and cheerfulness of someone who was determined to live as independently as possible. She worked diligently as a checker at the local Kroger grocery store, proudly riding her bicycle to and from her job every day, no matter the weather. Amy's world was small but meaningful, built around her family, her co-workers, and the few friends she trusted with childlike loyalty. She was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, offered to help carry groceries, and never questioned someone's intentions because malice was foreign to her nature. But it was precisely that trusting innocence that made her vulnerable, and tragically, it was the very quality that would be exploited by the two men she once considered friends. Michael Dewayne Hall was born in 1979 into a life that offered him little in the way of stability, compassion, or hope. Raised in a fractured household marred by instability and emotional neglect, Michael's formative years were defined more by absence than presence. Absent parental figures, absent affection, absent guidance, and ultimately absent identity. From a young age, he displayed signs of deep emotional turmoil, carrying with him a sense of alienation that only grew more profound as he entered adolescence. He struggled in school, both academically and socially, and quickly became known not for his accomplishments but for his inability to fit in. Peers found him awkward, teachers found him disengaged, and the world seemed to find no place for him. Crippled by low self-esteem and burdened by the chaos of a broken home, Hall fell into a pattern of academic failure, delinquency, and increasingly antisocial behavior. By the time he reached his late teens, Hall had accumulated a record of petty crimes, including theft and vandalism, acts not so much born of malice but of desperation and the desire to be seen. Beneath the surface, he was a young man drowning in anger, not just at the world but at himself, his upbringing, and the circumstances he couldn't control. He craved meaning, belonging, and attention. But lacking the tools to process his pain or forge a healthy identity, Michael became a follower. A boy in a man's body, susceptible to manipulation and easily swept up in the gravitational pull of stronger, darker personalities. Enter Robert Neville, the 23-year-old who would become the dominant figure in Hall's descent into violence. Unlike Hall, Neville was no passive observer of life's cruelty, he was its enforcer. With a prior criminal record, including assaults and weapons charges, and a reputation for aggression and intimidation, Neville was the kind of man who didn't just feel anger, he acted on it. Those who knew him described a short temper, a cold demeanor, and a disturbing fascination with control. To Hall, Neville was everything he wasn't: confident, assertive, and unafraid to push boundaries. But beneath that exterior lay a similarly broken human being. Only in Neville's case, the cracks had hardened into malignant intent. Together, the two men formed a volatile, parasitic relationship. Neville became the leader, the orchestrator, and Hall became the vessel, willing to do anything to feel seen, included, and relevant, even if it meant participating in unspeakable cruelty. Their personalities, though different in dominance, were tragically compatible in dysfunction. Where Neville brought rage, Hall brought resentment. Where Neville lacked empathy, Hall lacked purpose. And when they came together, their shared darkness found a single, horrifying outlet. Psychologists who reviewed the case, based on public records and behavioral evaluations, described Hall as someone who suffered from chronic emotional immaturity, poor impulse control, and a detachment from the value of human life, particularly when he believed he had nothing left to lose. Neville, on the other hand, exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, with a well-developed appetite for domination and a total absence of moral restraint. He didn't need a reason to hurt someone, just the opportunity. On the morning of February 15, 1998, a seemingly ordinary Sunday in Arlington, Texas, Michael Hall and Robert Neville sat parked in a car near the Kroger grocery store where their former co-worker and target, Amy Robinson, worked as a checker. Armed with a .22 caliber rifle, a pellet gun, and even a crossbow, they weren't there to give anyone a ride, despite the story they had rehearsed, but instead to fulfill a dark and premeditated fantasy of abduction and murder. When Amy rode by on her bicycle, trusting, kind-hearted, and unaware of the trap laid before her, she recognized the familiar faces of Hall and Neville, two men she had once worked beside, and accepted their offer for a ride to work, never imagining that this decision would lead her into the remote backroads of Tarrant County and ultimately to her death. As they drove nearly 12 miles into the countryside, the men chatted with her as if nothing were wrong, luring her deeper into their scheme, until Neville pretended the car had a flat tire and pulled over near a secluded stretch of rural road. There, under the overcast sky, surrounded by nothing but fields and silence, Amy stepped out of the vehicle as requested, still unsuspecting, still believing this was just a temporary detour. What followed, however, was a sequence of acts so cruel, so callous, that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the most sadistic crimes they had encountered. Neville, armed with a crossbow, took aim at Amy and fired multiple bolts, each one missing its mark, while Hall, instead of intervening or stopping the assault, shot her in the back of the leg with a pellet gun, laughing alongside Neville as Amy cried out in pain and confusion, struggling to understand why her former friends were tormenting her. When the crossbow failed, Neville retrieved a .22 caliber rifle from the vehicle and shot Amy directly in the chest, causing her to collapse as Hall continued to fire pellet rounds into her already wounded body, showing no mercy, no regret, only twisted amusement at her suffering. As Amy lay bleeding, still alive, still conscious, Neville delivered the final blow, a fatal shot to the head, ending her life in the cold dirt of a backroad field, with no one to hear her screams and no chance of escape. Satisfied with what they had done, the two men dragged her body into the brush, leaving it alongside her bicycle in an attempt to conceal the evidence, and drove off as if they had just completed a casual errand, believing their secret would remain buried in the dirt. But their cruelty didn't end there, because in the days to follow, they would return to the scene to desecrate her body further and steal from her remains, a final act of disgrace that revealed just how little regard they had for the life they took and the pain they caused. In the cold, unsettling aftermath of Amy Robinson's murder, neither Michael Hall nor Robert Neville showed an ounce of remorse. Instead, what they exhibited was a disturbing calmness, even a sense of accomplishment, as they resumed their day-to-day lives, never reporting the crime, never expressing regret, and never making an attempt to hide the fact that they had taken a life. But what truly shocked investigators later wasn't just the cruelty of the act itself, it was what the two men chose to do in the days that followed. Just a few days after the killing, as Amy's loved ones clung to hope and the community began to worry about her disappearance, Hall and Neville returned to the secluded rural field where her body lay undisturbed, decaying and hidden behind a brush-covered area they thought would shield them from discovery. This return wasn't driven by guilt or fear, it was driven by something far more depraved, a desire to relive the moment and finish what they had started. Standing once again over the body of the young woman they had so callously executed, Robert Neville retrieved the same .22 rifle and fired additional shots into her already lifeless body, as though killing her once wasn't enough, as if erasing every trace of her humanity was part of the plan. Meanwhile, Michael Hall knelt beside her, rummaging through the pockets of her clothes to steal a few dollars in cash and her set of keys, treating her remains not as the tragic victim of a horrific crime, but as a discarded object of entertainment and profit, a final act of desecration that would later horrify both jurors and the public alike. But as the days wore on, it wasn't guilt that caused cracks to form in their story, it was ego. Michael Hall, emboldened by what he thought was a successful murder, began talking about the killing, and not just in vague or cryptic terms. He gave explicit, boastful details to his stepbrother, bragging that he and Neville had kidnapped and killed Amy Robinson, describing it as if it were some sick badge of honor rather than a monstrous act. Hall's stepbrother, disturbed and uncertain of what to do, kept the secret for a short time, until Hall himself suddenly went missing. Concerned for her son's whereabouts, Michael Hall's mother contacted police, hoping to file a missing persons report, but when officers interviewed Hall's family, the truth began to unravel. His stepbrother finally came forward with what Hall had confessed, revealing the horrifying details that only the killer could have known. With Michael Hall's confession relayed to authorities by his stepbrother and the search intensifying, it wasn't long before police tracked down Hall and Neville. Just days after the murder, the pair were spotted near the Texas-Mexico border, traveling south in an apparent attempt to flee the country and vanish beyond the reach of U.S. justice. But luck, or perhaps justice itself, caught up with them when local law enforcement, working with border agents, apprehended the two in a vehicle not far from the crossing point, with weapons and stolen items still in their possession, including the very rifle used to end Amy Robinson's life. Back in police custody in Arlington, the interrogation rooms quickly became confession chambers, not because investigators cracked under pressure or used elaborate techniques, but because Michael Hall and Robert Neville were not interested in hiding what they'd done. In fact, they seemed eager to talk, almost relishing in the attention, as if the murder of an innocent girl had become their claim to fame. In one now infamous television interview, Hall looked directly into the camera, a casual smirk on his face, and described the murder as if it were a game, shrugging off questions about remorse and stating coldly that he did it because, quote, "I had a sucky-ass life, so I wanted to kill someone." Neville, sitting beside him, matched the same disturbing energy, calm, indifferent, and smirking as he spoke about the act of pulling the trigger and returning days later to desecrate the body. For both men, the murder of Amy Robinson was not only an act of violence, it was their twisted moment of notoriety. When the case reached the courts, the community watched in horror and the nation took notice. Media outlets covered every detail, every quote, every disturbing gesture. During the trial, the prosecution played the televised confessions in full, showing the jury firsthand the chilling indifference of the two young men. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture of premeditation, cruelty, and the utter dehumanization of their victim. They didn't just murder Amy Robinson. They hunted her, taunted her, laughed as she bled, and then boasted about it as if it were nothing more than a thrill. The defense, meanwhile, struggled to portray Hall and Neville as troubled youths, citing Hall's unstable upbringing, his age, and his mental health history, while attempting to shift blame toward Neville as the older, more experienced instigator. But the damage was done. The words spoken on camera, the gleeful descriptions of the murder, and the complete absence of remorse made the jury's decision swift and unequivocal. Both Michael Brandon Hall and Robert Neville were convicted of capital murder. The jury determined that the heinous nature of the crime, the planning, and the killer's utter lack of remorse left no room for leniency. Hall, just a teenager at the time of the killing, was sentenced to death, as was Neville. In Texas, a state known for its hard stance on capital punishment, the verdict was clear. This level of evil would be met with the full weight of justice. But the trial wasn't just about convictions. It was about restoring the humanity of Amy Robinson, a girl whose life had been reduced by her killers to a few minutes of suffering, and whose name had been dragged through television sets as if she were a prop in their story. Her parents, sitting through the trial, heard every graphic detail, saw the autopsy photos, and watched the video of the young men who once shared a workplace with their daughter laugh about her final moments. And yet, they stood with quiet dignity, pushing for justice, not revenge, knowing that no sentence could ever bring back Amy, but at the very least the killers would never again walk free. When the verdict was read and the word "guilty" echoed through the courtroom, there was no surprise, only the heavy weight of confirmation. Michael Brandon Hall and Robert Neville had been found guilty of the capital murder of Amy Robinson, and now came the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide whether these men, so young, so cold, should live the rest of their lives behind bars or pay with their own lives. For the jury, it wasn't simply about revenge, it was about whether these men posed a future threat to society, whether they had any hope for redemption, and whether their crime had crossed the invisible but unmistakable line between ordinary evil and the kind of pure, calculated sadism that demands the ultimate punishment. During this phase, prosecutors re-emphasized the horror of Amy's final moments, the calculated deception, the drawn-out torture, the final shots, and the fact that they returned to her body days later, not to bury her, not to repent, but to violate her again with gunfire and theft. They played the TV interviews where Hall and Neville smiled, joked, and described the killing like it was a school prank, not the cold-blooded execution of a young woman. The defense presented a different narrative. Hall's attorneys pointed to his age, just 18, his unstable childhood, a lack of father figures, and a history of emotional disturbance. They argued that Robert Neville, older and already experienced in criminal behavior, was the ringleader, and that Hall was a misguided, impressionable teen. They claimed Hall had potential for rehabilitation if given life in prison. Neville's team painted a similar picture but struggled under the weight of his criminal record, his older age and his leading role in the final, fatal shot. The jury wasn't moved. In a state that has executed more inmates than any other in modern U.S. history, the decision was delivered without hesitation. Both Michael Hall and Robert Neville were sentenced to death by lethal injection. It was a rare instance where two co-defendants in the same murder were both condemned, a reflection not just of the crime, but of the indifference, arrogance, and lack of remorse displayed by both men. But in Texas, a death sentence does not mean immediate execution. It signals the beginning of a lengthy legal battle through state and federal appeals. Over the following years, Michael Hall's attorneys filed appeal after appeal, citing his youth at the time of the crime, his supposed diminished mental capacity, and his co-defendants' greater influence as mitigating factors. They argued that Hall's death sentence was too harsh given that he didn't fire the final, fatal shot. However, every court, from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, upheld his sentence, stating that Hall's full participation, his mocking cruelty, and his admitted intention to kill someone for the sake of it made him equally culpable. But for Amy Robinson's family, each court date, each filing, each delay was another painful reopening of the wound, a reminder that justice, even when served, is never quick, and never enough to fill the hole left behind by a loved one taken far too soon. On February 15, 2011, precisely 13 years to the day after the abduction and murder of Amy Robinson, Michael Brandon Hall was escorted from his cell in the Pulaski Unit, Texas's infamous death row facility, and transferred to the nearby Huntsville Unit, the site of executions in the state known for carrying out the most capital punishments in the country. He was 31 years old now, no longer the impulsive 18-year-old who laughed as he fired pellets into a crying girl, but those who witnessed his final hours said he carried the same eerie calmness that defined his post-arrest interviews. If he felt regret, it wasn't written on his face. In the hours leading up to his execution, Hall was offered the traditional last meal allowed to condemned inmates in Texas at the time. His choice was simple and perhaps telling. Chicken cooked 3 different ways: pizza, brownies, sweet iced tea, milk and vanilla pudding. Nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic, just a basic comfort food request from a man whose life had been marked by bitterness and brutality. As the sun set over Huntsville, a small group of protesters gathered outside the prison's red brick walls, their candles flickering in the cold wind. Some called for an end to the death penalty. Others held signs bearing Amy Robinson's name. Inside the witness chamber, a thin pane of glass separated Michael Hall from a small group of observers, including reporters, state officials and members of Amy's family, who had waited more than a decade for this moment of closure. Shortly before 6 p.m., Hall was led into the execution chamber, strapped to the gurney, and fitted with IV lines in both arms. When asked if he had any final words, Hall took a breath and addressed both families. His last words, according to official records, were, "I would like to give my sincere apology to Amy's family. We caused a lot of heartache, grief, pain, and suffering, and I am sorry. I know it won't bring her back." He continued speaking, saying he was changed by Christ and was not the same person anymore, and asked for forgiveness. "I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." At 6:23 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began flowing through the intravenous lines. Witnesses reported that Hall closed his eyes, breathed deeply a few times and then stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m., just 3 minutes after the injection began. Michael Hall became the 3rd person executed in Texas in 2011, and the 244th person executed under Governor Rick Perry's administration, a statistic that underscores the state's unyielding stance on capital punishment. But for many who followed the case, it wasn't just about retribution, it was about remembrance. Because while Hall's name would fade from headlines, Amy's name would live on in memory, not as a victim but as a daughter, a friend, and a soul whose light was stolen far too soon. This case is more than just a story of crime and punishment. It's a haunting reminder of how easily lives can be lost at the hands of anger, influence, and reckless choices. What are your thoughts on the justice served in the case of Michael Hall and Robert Neville? Do you believe people like Hall can truly change before the end? We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you reflect, please give it a thumbs up. Share it with others so Amy's name is never forgotten. And if you want to see more deep dives into true crime stories just like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive.